He woke up to the soft light of early morning slipping through the curtains. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. He moved slowly, not rushing, savoring the calm before the day began. Life had been simple for a long time now. He liked it that way. No one really knew much about him, and that suited him fine. The neighbors thought of him as quiet, dependable, someone who waved politely but kept to himself. That was exactly how he wanted it. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee. He poured himself a cup, watching the steam curl upward. The routine felt comforting. Some people liked excitement or drama in their lives, but he had learned early that peace was often rarer than danger. He had a good job, a modest house in a suburban neighborhood, and the kind of neighbors who were polite but distant. He liked his quiet life, and he protected it carefully. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced at the neighborhood through the window. The street was waking up slowly. A few kids were riding their bikes, their laughter carrying across the morning air. Mailboxes clicked open as letters were delivered. Everything looked normal, calm, safe. Yet there was a small tension in the air that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't that the neighborhood was dangerous. It wasn't even that people were openly hostile. But recently there had been whispers, small acts that made some of the residents uneasy. Cars had been scratched, doors had been tagged with crude graffiti. Nothing serious yet, but the signs were there. Some people shrugged it off, calling it mischief. Others knew it was something more. He finished his coffee and went about his day. On the surface, he blended in perfectly. At work, he smiled, made small talk, and completed his tasks efficiently. No one there had any reason to suspect anything about him. He wasn't boastful, didn't talk about his past or personal achievements. He was polite, reserved, professional, but underneath that calm exterior, he was alert. Every small detail registered, and he remembered it. Not because he was paranoid, but because experience had taught him to notice things others overlooked. By midday, he was walking down the street to grab a sandwich. The sun was higher now, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of daily life. A group of teenagers were laughing loudly, tossing a basketball back and forth. A few neighbors chatted over fences. Everything seemed normal, but he kept his eyes moving, noticing who was watching, who was absent. He had learned long ago that danger often hid behind ordinary faces and everyday routines. He didn't need to act on it now, but knowing the rhythm of his surroundings was a skill he had honed over years. As he returned home, he noticed something that caught his attention. A couple of cars he didn't recognize were parked further down the street. Their drivers were leaning against them, talking quietly, but their eyes flicked toward the houses, scanning, observing. He didn't panic. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked slowly, pretending to adjust something in his bag, his eyes never leaving them for more than a second. People like that could mean nothing, or they could mean trouble. Experience had taught him that early recognition often made all the difference. The day continued without incident. He went through his usual tasks at home, checking the mail, fixing a small leak in the kitchen sink, watering the plants he had grown over the years. He liked these small, quiet responsibilities. They made him feel grounded, connected to a life that was safe, predictable, and his own. At night, he would sit in the living room reading, watching the news, occasionally sipping tea. The ordinary life he led was a mask, a shield, and it had served him well. But no matter how quiet or ordinary a life seemed, the past had a way of reminding people who they really were. He had learned that lesson early, during times that most people could not even imagine. The skills, the discipline, the knowledge he carried were not things he shared. They were tools tucked away behind the calm surface of his life. He rarely used them, rarely spoke of them, and he had no reason to. Yet they were always there, a silent presence in the background of his daily routine. On this particular evening, he walked outside for a brief stroll. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the air carried the faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier in the day. He liked evenings. They brought a sense of closure, a moment to reflect before night fully settled in. He walked slowly, enjoying the quiet, noticing small things, the way the wind moved through the trees, the distant bark of a dog, the sound of a neighbor closing a door. Every detail mattered. Even if he didn't need it now, knowing these details could make a difference later. When he returned to his house, everything seemed normal. The porch light cast a warm glow, the door was locked, and there were no signs of anything unusual. He prepared dinner, listened to soft music, and settled into a routine that was familiar and comforting. He was tired from the day but content. In many ways, he felt lucky. He had built a life that was peaceful, safe, and unremarkable to outsiders. But the ordinary peace he enjoyed was fragile, and he knew it. As he washed the dishes, a small thought crossed his mind. Just a quiet, fleeting thought that the world was not always fair. Some people acted out of hate, out of fear, or out of ignorance. Most times, those actions were harmless or contained. But occasionally, they crossed a line. He didn't dwell on the thought. He had lived long enough to know that worrying about what might happen did not prevent it. Action, preparation, and calm observation did. He finished his evening with a brief walk around the yard, checking the fences, the doors, and the windows. Everything was as it should be. Then he stood quietly for a moment, listening to the neighborhood settle into night. The air was cooler now, the streets quieter. In that moment, he felt a rare sense of complete calm. Life was ordinary. Everything was normal. And yet, deep down, he knew that ordinary could change in an instant. As he turned back toward the house, locking the door behind him, there was no hint of what was to come. No warning, no sign. Just the quiet hum of life, the faint scent of evening flowers, and the soft glow of streetlights. He was unaware of the storm that would arrive, unaware that the world outside his door was about to challenge everything he held dear. And yet he was ready. Not in a way anyone could see, not in a way that anyone would suspect, but he was ready in ways that few could imagine. He went to bed that night reading for a few minutes before turning off the light. The house was quiet, the neighborhood sleeping. The calm felt complete, almost sacred, and as he drifted into sleep there was a small, quiet certainty in him. Whatever happened, he could handle it. He had handled far worse. The ordinary life he led might seem peaceful, but beneath the surface he was always prepared. Always alert, always ready. No one would ever suspect it. To the outside world he was just a quiet man, living an ordinary life. To his neighbors he was friendly, polite, and reserved. To the world he was invisible. But in the shadows of that invisibility was a man who had faced danger, who had survived against impossible odds, and who had the knowledge, skill, and discipline to protect what mattered most. And so, the first part of his story ended not with a clash, not with a dramatic event, but with quiet. The calm before the storm, the ordinary life of a man who was anything but ordinary, living in a world that was about to reveal just how extraordinary he truly was. The next morning, he woke to a strange feeling. It was subtle, almost like the air itself had shifted. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. He moved through his routine as usual, showering, making coffee, checking the mailbox, but his mind kept drifting to the streets outside. He didn't see anything unusual yet, but experience had taught him that feelings like this were rarely wrong. When he stepped outside to collect the morning newspaper, his eyes froze on the front yard. The sight made his heart tighten. Windows were shattered. The wooden fence he had carefully maintained was splintered in places. Spray-painted words covered the garage door, crude and hateful in every stroke. His mailbox had been ripped from its post and lay on the ground. The front door had deep scratches, as if someone had tried to force it open. For a moment he just stood there, taking it all in. He had expected trouble, maybe minor mischief, but this was different. It was violent, deliberate, meant to send a message. It was personal, though he didn't know the faces behind it yet. Neighbors had started to gather, murmuring among themselves, their faces showing shock, confusion, and a hint of fear. He walked slowly toward the house, his eyes scanning every detail. Nothing was out of place that shouldn't have been. Nothing had been stolen, but the damage was extensive. Whoever did this had wanted him to feel violated, unsafe. The thought made his jaw tighten, but outwardly he remained calm. Calm was part of his way of handling things. Panic solved nothing, fear solved nothing. Observation, planning, and action, those solved problems. A neighbor, an older man who lived across the street, approached him. "Did you see anyone? Any idea who did this?" he asked, his voice low, filled with concern. He shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't see anyone, but I'll figure it out." His voice was calm, almost unnervingly calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation with anger or accusations. That came later. First, he needed facts. First, he needed to understand what had happened. The police arrived quickly after the call. They examined the damage, took notes, and asked him questions. He answered politely, providing details without speculation. I didn't see anyone, he told them again. I don't know who did this. He kept his tone neutral, revealing nothing that might hint at who he really was. As the officers left, promising to investigate, he stood on his porch for a long time. The house was quiet again, the street returning to normal, but his mind was far from calm. Every detail mattered. The way the spray paint was applied, the scratches on the door, the paths of the footprints. These were all clues, and he noticed them all. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was simply surveying damage, but in his mind, he was already reconstructing the night, replaying possible scenarios, imagining who might have done this and why. Later that day, he walked slowly through the neighborhood, observing. There were kids playing, dogs barking, neighbors chatting as if nothing had happened. But he saw the small things. A broken branch here, a suspicious figure walking a little too slowly there, the way some people's eyes lingered on certain houses. Nothing overt, nothing clear yet, but subtle patterns began to emerge. In the afternoon, he began to notice how the attack had affected people around him. One neighbor was afraid to leave her house, clutching her keys tightly. Another had spoken openly about moving, worried about safety. The subtle fear that spread like a shadow across the neighborhood bothered him, but he kept it hidden. He understood fear. He knew it could control people, influence decisions, and limit actions, and he didn't want anyone paralyzed by it. As evening approached, he walked past the vandalized house again, this time examining it more carefully. He noticed marks that the police might not have picked up. Tiny scratches that suggested a ladder had been used, scuffs indicating movement from one side of the property to the other. He could almost reconstruct the sequence of events just from these small clues. His mind moved quickly, logically, piecing together possibilities while maintaining outward calm. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. He began jotting down observations, details, and questions. Who would do this? Why target him? Was it random or was it personal? The words filled the pages as his thoughts flowed. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He planned. He knew that the answers would come with careful observation, patience, and preparation. Sleep came later than usual. Even when he lay in bed, the images of the day kept replaying. Graffiti, scratches, broken glass, they stayed in his mind, but not in a way that caused fear. Instead, they sharpened his focus. Every instinct he had honed over years of discipline, training, and experience came alive quietly in his mind. He didn't need to act yet. He only needed to be ready. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. News of the vandalism had spread. People whispered as they walked past his house, glancing at the damage with curiosity and pity. Some offered words of sympathy, while others shook their heads in disbelief. He thanked them politely but said nothing more. His attention was elsewhere. He spent the morning walking slowly around the property, checking fences, doors, and windows again. Each observation led to another question, another detail. Who had been there? How had they gained access? Had they scouted the house beforehand? Every possibility ran through his mind, tested, discarded, or stored for later consideration. He began to notice more patterns as he observed the neighborhood. Some houses nearby had similar signs of intimidation, scratches on doors, spray paint in the wrong places, small acts meant to unsettle. It was not random. It was a message. And while most people were afraid, he felt something else: clarity. He understood that these were not isolated acts of chance. They were deliberate, targeted, and that meant he could anticipate, predict, and respond. Over the next few days, he moved carefully, but deliberately. He adjusted routines slightly, watched the movements of cars and people, and listened to conversations. At first, the changes were almost invisible. To anyone else, he was just walking more slowly, pausing longer on the street, perhaps lost in thought. But in reality, he was studying, analyzing, and preparing. The vandals did not strike again immediately. Instead, their presence became a shadow over the neighborhood. People spoke less, avoided certain streets, and watched for strangers. Fear settled in like a fog, invisible but tangible. He noticed it all. How it influenced people, how it changed the rhythm of the streets. But he did not allow it to influence him. His calm, quiet demeanor remained intact. One evening, he sat by the window watching the street as the sun set. The light faded, leaving long shadows across the sidewalks. He noticed movement at the far end of the block. Two figures, quiet, watching. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. Instead, he noted their posture, their timing, the direction of their gaze. He had seen this behavior before. Not in a neighborhood, not in daily life, but in situations where threats were real, calculated, and dangerous. He realized that the vandals were returning, testing boundaries, seeking reaction. And that reaction, if uncontrolled, could lead to more trouble, not just for him but for the people around him. That thought hardened his resolve. He would not allow chaos to spread. He would not allow fear to control the neighborhood. But he also knew he could not confront them recklessly. Patience, planning, and precise action were necessary. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, he began to prepare quietly. Not weapons or aggressive tools, but observation, surveillance, and contingency plans. Every street corner, every potential hiding place, every route the vandals might take, it was all considered. Every possibility was weighed, every potential outcome analyzed. He knew that most people would have reacted with anger, fear, or a desperate call to authorities. But he did not. He had lived through situations far more dangerous, far more unpredictable. He knew that the key to surviving and controlling the situation was calm, preparation, and careful observation. Fear would have been a mistake. Panic would have been worse. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had settled into a fragile rhythm. People were cautious, wary, and afraid, but life continued. And in the midst of it all, he remained calm, alert, and ready. Every detail he had observed, every pattern he had noticed would later become crucial. The vandals had made a mistake. They underestimated him, assumed he was ordinary, assumed that their actions would intimidate him. What they didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that beneath the quiet exterior, beneath the polite demeanor and ordinary routines, was a man capable of far more than anyone could imagine. The ordinary life they saw was a mask. The real man was trained, disciplined, and highly skilled. And while he would not strike recklessly, he would not allow injustice to go unanswered. The calm of Part 2 ended not with violence, but with anticipation. The vandals believed they had tested their boundaries. The neighborhood believed in fragile safety. But the man at the center of it all was quietly preparing, studying, and planning. The storm was coming, but it would come on his terms, precise, controlled, and inevitable. And he was ready. Days passed after the vandalism, but the tension in the neighborhood did not fade. People spoke in hushed tones when walking past his house. Some wondered if the vandals would strike again, while others debated whether to move before more damage occurred. He noticed the fear, but he did not let it touch him. Fear was useful when you controlled it, useless when it controlled you. He had learned that lesson long ago. He began each morning the same way as he always had, but now with extra attention to detail. Every sound, every movement, every stranger in the neighborhood was noted and stored. He walked to work, to the store, even to the mailbox with calm purpose. Outwardly, he remained the same quiet, polite man who kept to himself. But inside, his mind was always active, calculating, observing patterns, and predicting possibilities. At first, he simply watched. He noticed the same cars parked in unusual places. He saw people loitering, talking in corners, keeping an eye on the houses nearby. Some behaviors were subtle, almost invisible to anyone untrained, but to him they spoke volumes. He remembered the scratches on his door, the spray paint on the garage, the broken mailbox. Each small act told a story. Each pattern pointed to something more. At home, he began making small adjustments. He repaired the damage to the fence, cleaned the spray paint, and replaced broken glass. But he did more than that. He subtly changed the way he moved around his property, testing sightlines, observing which areas were exposed, which were hidden. He took note of every possible entry point, every shadow where someone might hide. The process was methodical, quiet, and careful. Neighbors watched him work, but they saw only ordinary activity, someone taking care of their home, someone cautious after an incident. They had no idea he was also studying, preparing, and planning. They did not know that under his calm exterior, he was already imagining scenarios, predicting moves before they happened. Some evenings, he would take longer walks through the neighborhood. Not for exercise, not for leisure, but for observation. He noticed patterns he had missed during the day. A young man always taking the same route home, pausing at the same corner to look back. A group of teenagers gathering in the park, lingering longer when certain neighbors passed by. Small details, insignificant to most, were clues to him. Every observation added a layer to the picture he was quietly building. He also began watching the reactions of people when they thought no one was paying attention. Some were careful, cautious. Others were sloppy, careless. Both types of behavior were useful to him. The cautious ones indicated awareness, intelligence, and potential influence. The careless ones indicated weakness, opportunity, and risk. His mind filed each piece of information away for later use. During the day, he would go about his usual work routine. Polite smiles, small talk with coworkers, friendly greetings with neighbors. Nothing out of the ordinary. But in the quiet moments, when no one was looking, his thoughts turned to strategy. He imagined how someone might attempt to cause more damage. He considered how people might act under pressure, what mistakes they would make, what opportunities could arise. Each day, his understanding of the situation grew sharper. One afternoon, he noticed two men walking slowly down the street, pausing in front of houses, glancing repeatedly at his own. They were subtle in their movements, trying not to draw attention, but their actions were predictable to him. He observed them quietly from behind a curtain, noting their posture, the way they moved, the small gestures of hesitation or interest. He did not confront them. That was not yet necessary. Observation came first. Action would come later. He also began testing the neighborhood without drawing attention. Small changes in his own routines, small adjustments in timing, slight movements that would reveal if anyone was paying attention. He walked different routes to the mailbox, adjusted the timing of his morning coffee, left doors slightly ajar to see if anyone noticed. Each reaction, each lack of reaction, provided more information. He was quietly mapping the neighborhood, the people, the potential threats, and their behaviors. At home, he began preparing the house more carefully. Locks were checked and reinforced. Windows were examined, identifying weak points. He did not make these changes obvious. To neighbors, it looked like ordinary precaution after vandalism. But in reality, he was creating layers of security, testing vulnerabilities and preparing contingencies. Every detail mattered, and he spared no thought in ensuring he was ready for whatever might come. He also began practicing small skills quietly, not to intimidate or show off, but to keep his mind sharp and maintain discipline. His movements were precise, efficient, controlled. Each motion had purpose. Each action, no matter how small, was deliberate. It was as if the calm man the neighborhood knew was only half of who he was. The other half, trained, alert, disciplined, remained hidden, silent, and ready. Neighbors began to notice changes in the neighborhood. Fewer people lingered on the streets. Conversations became quieter. Children were watched more closely by parents. Fear was subtle but spreading. He noticed it all but remained unaffected. He understood fear, but he did not allow it to control him. Instead, he used it to learn, to observe, to prepare. By the end of the week, he had constructed a mental map of the neighborhood. Every street, every house, every hiding spot had a purpose in his mind. He knew which areas were vulnerable, which people might be involved, and which patterns were most likely to lead to the vandals. He did not rush. He did not act impulsively. He waited. Patience, he knew, was as important as skill. One night after the neighborhood had gone quiet, he noticed movement at a distance, figures moving slowly, carefully, scanning the houses. They were testing boundaries again. He watched silently from a darkened window, noting their every move. Their confidence seemed greater than before, as if they believed no one was watching. But he was watching. Every step they took, every hesitation, every glance was recorded in his mind. He knew that confrontation would come eventually, but not tonight. Tonight was for learning, for observing, for understanding the patterns. Action would be precise, controlled, and effective. He did not need to act recklessly. That was never his style. His training, his experience, had taught him that the right action at the right time was far more powerful than hasty aggression. Days turned into a week, and the vandals' behavior became more predictable. They began testing different houses, approaching more boldly but always with caution. He watched from shadows, noting every detail, every pattern, every small mistake they made. They did not know he was observing them, analyzing them, preparing. They assumed he was just another quiet neighbor, unaware of the danger approaching. During this time, he also helped others in subtle ways. When a neighbor expressed fear, he offered advice on security without revealing his own capabilities. When another neighbor asked about locks or cameras, he explained ordinary precautions. He did not seek recognition. He did not need it. His actions were careful, controlled, and meant to create calm without panic. The neighborhood remained fragile, but functional, unaware that someone was quietly protecting them. Even as he prepared, he maintained his calm exterior. Polite smiles, casual conversation, friendly greetings. These were masks that kept him invisible. No one suspected the depth of his preparation, the extent of his observation, or the quiet storm building beneath the surface. That was exactly how he wanted it. Invisibility was a tool. Patience was a weapon. By the end of Part 3, the stage was set. The Vandals had made their presence known, testing boundaries and creating fear. The neighborhood was tense, wary, and unprepared. And yet, at the center of it all, the quiet man in the ordinary house was ready. Not yet to strike, not yet to confront, but ready. Every detail had been noted, every movement studied, every possibility considered. The calm man the world saw was ordinary, polite, quiet. The man they did not see, the man who had lived through impossible situations, who had trained, survived, and mastered his skills, was ready. The storm would come, but it would come on his terms. Every move would be calculated, precise, and unstoppable. And he would wait, watch, and act when the time was right. In the shadows of the ordinary street, he prepared. In the quiet of the night, he observed. In the calm of his home, he planned. The Vandals were unaware of what was coming. They assumed control, they assumed power, they assumed ignorance. But they were wrong. And soon, very soon, they would learn just how mistaken they had been. The neighborhood was unusually quiet that evening. The sun had dipped low, painting the streets in shades of orange and deep purple. The quiet was heavy, almost unnatural, like the calm before a storm. He stepped outside briefly, scanning the surroundings as he always did, noting shadows, movement, and any sound that didn't belong. His eyes were sharp, his senses alert. The Vandals were out there, testing the streets again. He could feel it. He noticed them almost immediately. Two figures moving slowly, their heads tilted as they examined houses, pausing longer than usual near the corner. They assumed no one was watching, that the quiet man in the ordinary house would not notice. They were wrong. Every movement, every pause, every glance was recorded, analyzed, and stored. He didn't rush. There was no need. Time was on his side. As he observed, he planned. This would not be a reckless confrontation. There would be no wild chase, no uncontrolled chaos. He would act strategically, using precision and careful timing. Years of experience had taught him that control was far more effective than force, and patience often yielded results that brute strength never could. He quietly retrieved a flashlight and a pair of binoculars from a small storage area, not weapons. He didn't need them yet. Tonight was about assessment, about understanding how the Vandals operated. From a hidden position near the edge of the property, he watched as they moved closer to his street, their confidence growing. Their arrogance was evident. They had damaged his home before, and they believed they could do it again. Minutes passed. He took careful note of their habits, the way one of them constantly glanced around, the hesitation in their step when approaching corners, the signals they gave each other with subtle hand gestures. These were not random acts. These were patterns, and he recognized them. Patterns revealed weakness, opportunities, and the best moments to act. Finally, the Vandals split up. One approached the street closest to his property, while the other lingered farther back. It was the opening he had been waiting for. He did not rush. He moved silently, using shadows and the cover of objects, remaining almost invisible even as he closed the distance. Every step was deliberate, measured, controlled. As he positioned himself, he considered every potential outcome. If they noticed him too early, it could turn dangerous. If he acted too quickly, they might panic, flee, or escalate the situation. His training, his experience, had taught him to remain calm, think ahead, and use the environment to his advantage. The goal was not to harm recklessly, but to neutralize the threat and send a message they could not ignore. The first figure reached the edge of his property. He waited until the man paused, distracted by the quiet street, and then he acted. Swiftly, silently, he stepped into view. The figure froze. There was no sudden shout, no aggressive movement, just the quiet, confident presence of someone who did not need to threaten, but whose presence alone commanded attention. "Stop," he said, his voice calm but firm. It carried authority without anger. The figure glanced around, confusion written clearly on his face. He realized immediately that he had underestimated this man. He had assumed fear, hesitation, and maybe even ignorance. He was wrong. Without warning, the other figure approached, probably thinking the first was alone. By the time he reached the street corner, he saw the calm man standing there, observing, waiting. The moment of hesitation was all it took. The vandal's confidence began to crumble. They exchanged glances, suddenly aware that they were no longer in control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence, his measured movements, and his calm authority were enough to unbalance them. He stepped closer, but never threatening, never reckless. He wanted them to understand clearly that their actions had consequences. That fear could be experienced without harm, if one had the control to instill it. One of them tried to speak, stammering excuses, apologies that sounded hollow. He listened, silent, unblinking. Then he shook his head slowly, almost sadly, as if disappointed in their behavior. "You think this is clever?" he said quietly. "Breaking into someone's life, leaving fear behind? You don't know who you're dealing with." The vandals glanced at each other, panic creeping into their movements. Their small mistakes, their hesitations were all that he needed. He did not raise a hand, did not need to. He simply demonstrated control. Control over the environment, control over timing, control over the situation. They were unprepared for someone so calm, so aware, so confident. He used subtle tactics, trained techniques he had learned and perfected over years. Small gestures, shifts in posture, and positioning to keep them disoriented without causing injury. They stumbled backward, losing balance, trying to regain composure. He spoke softly, explaining consequences, exposing flaws in their behavior and planting doubt in their minds. The fear that followed was not sudden, not dramatic, but persistent, creeping into every thought they had about the encounter. Minutes passed like hours. He observed every micro-expression, every slight movement. The vandals were growing desperate, realizing they had lost control. The situation could have escalated into chaos, but he kept it measured, predictable, and entirely under his control. By the end of the encounter, their initial bravado had dissolved completely. They were afraid, not just of him, but of the consequences they could no longer predict or manage. He allowed them to leave, not violently, not recklessly, but with the message delivered clearly. Their actions had consequences, their arrogance had been exposed, and their attempts to intimidate would no longer succeed. They stumbled away, their confidence shattered, and disappeared into the shadows of the neighborhood. He remained on the street a while longer, observing. Every pattern, every movement, every hesitation had been recorded in his mind. He noted that the vandals had tried again, had underestimated him, and had been outmatched without him having to resort to extreme force. That was the lesson he wanted them to learn. Fear could be controlled. Chaos could be contained. Justice did not always need violence. Once the vandals were gone, he returned home. The house, the yard, the quiet neighborhood, it all looked normal. But he knew that life would never be quite the same for those two men. Their perception of power, their arrogance had been dismantled in a way that would leave a lasting impression. And the neighborhood, though unaware of the encounter, would remain safer because of it. Inside his home, he cleaned up, repaired minor disturbances caused by the encounter, and settled back into his calm routine. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Neighbors passing by would see him in his usual manner, quiet, polite, unassuming. But inside, he reflected on what had happened, analyzing every detail, noting what had worked, what had not, and what he might need to prepare for in the future. He understood that fear was a tool. It could be instilled without harm, used to control a situation without creating unnecessary danger. He also knew that direct confrontation was only one part of a larger strategy. Observation, patience, and preparation had made this encounter successful. The Vandals had been neutralized not through aggression, but through precision, confidence, and control. The night settled into quiet. The neighborhood streets were empty, the houses dark, and the usual sounds of daily life absent. He walked slowly through his yard, checking fences and doors once more, ensuring that no further surprises awaited him. Everything was secure. Everything was under control. And yet he remained vigilant. Experience had taught him that danger often returned in unexpected ways, and readiness could never be abandoned. By the end of Part 4, the Vandals had learned an important lesson. They had assumed power, underestimated the quiet man, and discovered that their arrogance could be dismantled without a fight in the traditional sense. For the first time, they understood that actions have consequences, and that some people were far more capable than they appeared. The calm man had acted decisively, but without haste. He had neutralized the threat while maintaining his own principles and ensuring the neighborhood remained unaware of the full extent of his capabilities. He had sent a message that would be remembered, not with fear for him personally, but with fear of underestimating the unknown. And so, the stage was set for the final part. The neighborhood had been shaken but not destroyed. The Vandals had been taught a lesson, yet the story was far from over. The quiet man remained at the center, calm, vigilant, and prepared for whatever might come next. His ordinary life continued, outwardly unchanged but with a presence that ensured the streets were safer than they had been before. The days after the confrontation passed quietly, almost deceptively so. The neighborhood seemed calmer, more cautious, but life continued. Children played in yards, neighbors tended gardens, and the occasional car passed slowly down the street. Everything looked ordinary, but the air had changed. There was a subtle shift in the rhythm of daily life, a quiet awareness that things were no longer exactly the same. He noticed it all, of course, but outwardly, he remained the same calm, polite man everyone had always seen. He spent his mornings as usual, walking to the mailbox, greeting neighbors with a nod, observing everything without drawing attention. He checked locks, secured windows, and made small adjustments around the house, but nothing dramatic. Everything he did was subtle, almost invisible. To anyone else, he appeared to be the same quiet neighbor who had lived on the street for years. No one would have guessed that, just a few days earlier, he had faced down a group of vandals and ensured their behavior would never threaten the neighborhood again. Some neighbors began to speak in whispers about the strange calm that had returned. The Vandals had disappeared, and the fear that had been spreading like a shadow seemed to dissipate almost as quickly as it had come. People speculated quietly, sharing their theories, but no one truly knew what had happened. They did not realize that someone had watched, analyzed, and intervened without fanfare. They did not know that the quiet man in the unassuming house had been the reason for the sudden peace. He did not seek attention or recognition. That was never his way. He had learned long ago that power was not in being noticed, but in being prepared. Quiet confidence, patience, and careful observation had ensured the neighborhood's safety without needing dramatic displays. The Vandals had learned their lesson, and the lesson had been effective precisely because it had been subtle and controlled. Even as the neighborhood returned to its routines, he remained vigilant. He observed small movements, listened to conversations, and noticed behaviors that others would dismiss. He had learned that danger rarely announced itself loudly. It came quietly, slowly, and often when least expected. Being prepared did not mean acting all the time. It meant noticing, understanding, and planning for what could happen next. One afternoon, he walked to the local store. The streets were full of ordinary life. Children laughing, neighbors chatting, cars moving along. He greeted people politely, smiled when acknowledged, and returned to his usual routines. And yet, in the quiet of his mind, he reflected on the events of the past week. He thought about the Vandals, their arrogance, their mistakes, and how easily they had been outmatched by calm, observation, and precision. He did not feel satisfaction in a conventional sense. There was no joy in seeing others scared or humbled. There was only clarity, a sense of purpose fulfilled. Back at home, he began repairing small things around the house. Windows were checked again, locks reinforced, fences mended. Nothing major needed attention, but he liked to maintain order. It was a way of keeping control, not just over his surroundings, but over himself. Each action, however ordinary, was deliberate and mindful. The quiet routines of daily life were grounding, a reminder that peace was worth protecting.